Aaliyah had only asked one thing. "One seat, please. My mother might not make it through the night." But the white gate agent didn't even pretend to hide the disgust crawling across his face. He looked her up and down slowly, tired eyes, thrift store coat, hospital wristband still on her arm, and smirked like her pain was entertainment. "You people always show up last minute," he said, loud enough for the whole boarding area to hear. Aaliyah froze. Her suitcase slipped from her hand. Her voice trembled. "Sir, I was only on the phone with the nurse." "I didn't miss boarding," he cut her off sharply. "Enough. Step aside. You're holding up paying passengers." Someone in line muttered, "She's lying," another whispered, always expecting special treatment. Aaliyah's breath caught in her throat. Her mother was dying, and this stranger decided she didn't deserve humanity. She reached for her boarding pass with shaking fingers, when suddenly the gate agent grabbed her wrist. Hard, too hard. His fingers dug into her skin like she was an object he needed to remove. "Back away," he hissed. "Don't cause a scene." Aaliyah gasped, stumbling backward. Everyone stared. No one helped. Not one hand reached out, except a calm, steady voice behind her cut through the tension like a blade. "That's enough." Deep, controlled, dangerous in its quietness. A tall white man in a charcoal coat stepped forward. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His presence shifted the entire air around them. The gate agent's jaw loosened. He swallowed hard like fear had climbed up his throat. His grip on Aaliyah fell away instantly. The man spoke again, soft but absolute. "Let her on the flight." The gate agent blinked fast. "But this isn't she. Let her on." For the first time all night, Aaliyah felt something she hadn't felt in hours. A breath. A chance. A moment where someone finally saw her. The agent scanned her ticket with shaking hands. She walked down the jet bridge, wrist throbbing, heart bruised, soul shaken. But inside her chest, a question began to burn. Who was that man? And why did he defend her when no one else dared? If this already made your blood boil, tap like, and subscribe so you don't miss stories where justice finally wins. As soon as Aaliyah stepped into the airplane cabin, the noise faded behind her like a bad dream trapped at the gate, but the sting on her wrist stayed. Every heartbeat throbbed against the red mark the agent had left. She found her seat, middle row, crowded, barely enough space to breathe. She lowered her head, hiding her face, praying no one recognized the humiliation she'd just endured. Then the footsteps came, steady, unhurried. Someone stopped right beside her row. Aaliyah looked up and her breath caught. The same man who defended her stood there, holding his ticket and pointing to the empty seat beside her. He was her seatmate. No way. Not possible. Not after a moment like that. He didn't say a word, just offered a small, almost reluctant nod, and took his seat with the calmness of someone who never needed introductions. Aaliyah clenched her fingers together. "Thank you for earlier," she whispered. He didn't look at her, just answered quietly, "You didn't deserve that." Then the plane pushed back from the gate. The cabin lights dimmed in exhaustion, thick, heavy, all-consuming, pulled her under like a tide. Her eyes slipped shut. Her head dropped. And before she even realized it, she was leaning into him, her cheek against his shoulder, breathing soft, exhausted breaths into the expensive fabric of his charcoal coat. She jerked awake, mortified. "Oh, Lord, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean..." He turned to her gently. "You're exhausted," he said. Not judgmental, not annoyed, just a simple truth spoken softly. A flight attendant appeared. Tight smile for him, cold stare for her. "Drinks?" she asked. Aaliyah shook her head quickly. "No, thank you." But the man spoke first. "She'll have a sandwich and ginger ale." Aaliyah blinked. I'm fine, really." He looked at her with a calm firmness. "You haven't eaten." The softness in his tone hit deeper than she expected. People didn't talk to her like that. Not strangers. Especially not strangers from his world. As the food arrived, a thought crept into her mind. Dangerous, impossible, and echoing louder than she wanted. Who exactly was this man and why did he care? If this happened in front of you, what would you do? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if you stand for fairness, hit subscribe. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The hum of the engines filled the quiet between them, warm and steady like a blanket she hadn't felt in years. Aaliyah lifted the ginger ale slowly, the cold and trembling against her palm. It wasn't just exhaustion. It was everything she'd been holding back since the nurse's call earlier that afternoon. He noticed. Of course he noticed. Long day, he asked softly. She swallowed hard. My mama, she's in the hospital back home. They said she might not make it through the night. Her voice cracked at the end, small, fragile, breaking open the cramped airplane seat. He turned toward her, fully, intentionally, not the half glance people give when they're being polite. This was the look of someone actually listening. I'm sorry, he said, and the sincerity in those two words almost undid her. She tried to breathe, but the sting in her wrist pulsed again, pulling her back to that moment at the gate. The humiliation, the whispers, the grip, his fingers digging into her like she didn't belong. The man's eyes drifted down and landed on a red bruise forming around her wrist. His jaw tightened, not dramatically, not with anger he wanted the world to notice, just a subtle clench, controlled, dangerous, like someone who wasn't used to feeling powerless. That mark, he said quietly. He did that. Aaliyah nodded once. He exhaled slowly, a hollow, measured breath, as if counting backwards from something sharp. That shouldn't have happened to you. She shrugged weakly, a gesture built from years of swallowing injustice. It happens. People see a tired black woman and think they know everything. She paused. Sometimes it's easier to pretend it doesn't hurt. But her voice gave the truth away. It hurt. It always hurt. He didn't interrupt. He didn't try to fix her pain with empty comfort. He just listened, something she wasn't used to. Aaliyah pulled her thin hoodie tighter around herself. I worked double shifts in a care home. Been doing overnight duty for 2 weeks straight. I just needed to see her. Before, her words faded into the low cabin light. He reached toward the seat pocket, pulled out his charger, and placed it quietly beside her hand. You'll need this. She blinked. Why would you? Because you're running on what little you have left, he said, and you shouldn't have to. For the first time since boarding, Aaliyah felt a breath loosen in her chest. Not because he saved her, not because he was gentle, but because, maybe for the first time in a long while, someone wasn't looking at her and seeing a burden. They were seeing a person. The plane touched down with a soft jolt, the cabin lights brightening as passengers reached for overhead bags and hurried lives. Aaliyah moved slowly, her body aching from the weight of grief, exhaustion, and everything she couldn't say out loud. The man beside her stood first. Calm, steady. He grabbed his coat with the ease of someone who'd lived 1,000 organized mornings. Aaliyah wiped her eyes quickly, embarrassed for reasons she couldn't explain. Thank you again, for being kind. He paused, just long enough to look at her. You deserve better than today. She opened her mouth to reply, when a shadow fell across their row. 2 uniformed airport security officers stopped at the front of the cabin. Their posture was formal, respectful, but not toward her, toward him. Sir, one officer said, straightening, your car is ready. They're waiting at the private exit. Private exit? Aaliyah blinked. The officer continued, your team already checked in. If you need additional escort, I'm fine. The man said simply, no raised voice, no ego, just pure authority. The officer nodded and stepped back like he'd just been dismissed by someone he couldn't afford to offend. Passengers stared. Whispers rose. Someone murmured, that's him, isn't it? Another whispered, I told you he looked familiar. Aaliyah felt something strange push up through her chest, confusion, curiosity, and a little fear. The man adjusted his coat, preparing to leave. Before stepping into the aisle, he turned back to her for one final moment. There was a softness there, a sincerity that didn't match the world bowing to him outside. Get to your mother safely, Aaliyah, he said quietly, her name slipping from his lips like he'd memorized it. She froze. How did you? But he was already walking away, escorted by security, like a ghost of an identity she still couldn't place. Aaliyah pressed her fingers to her lips, heart racing. Who was he? And why did someone like him care about someone like her? This wasn't just a stranger anymore. This was a secret, a puzzle, a man whose world clearly existed far above hers. Yet he stepped into hers anyway. And somewhere deep in her gut, Aaliyah knew this wasn't the last time she'd see him. If you believe talent can silence every insult, share this video. And to everyone watching from the US, UK, and Canada, your voice matters. The Montgomery air felt heavier than Aaliyah remembered, thicker, like even the wind knew sorrow was coming. She hurried through the small airport, clutching her bag to her chest, breath shaking with every step. The last message from the nurse replayed in her mind on a loop. Come as soon as you can. She's fading. By the time Aaliyah reached the hospital doors, her legs were trembling. The fluorescent hallway lights buzzed softly overhead as she rushed past nurses and visitors, turning corners she knew by heart. Room 214. She stopped at the doorway, fingers pressed against the cold metal handle, afraid to open it, afraid of what waited on the other side. Inside, her mother lay still, small, fragile, her chest rising only in shallow, uneven breaths. Aaliyah stepped closer, knees nearly giving out as she sank beside the bed. Mama, I made it, she whispered. I'm here. I'm right here. Her mother didn't open her eyes, but her fingers twitched just slightly, like she knew her daughter's voice even for the edge of a fading world. Aaliyah laid her head gently on her mother's hand, letting the silence swallow her whole. Tears slipped down her face, warm against cold skin. For a while, she just breathed with her. In, out, trying to lend her mother whatever rhythm she had left. When the nurse returned an hour later, her expression said everything. Aaliyah didn't scream, didn't collapse. She simply closed her mother's hand inside both of hers, held it against her forehead, and let her heart break quietly, the way Black women are forced to do far too often. After pronouncement, after the paperwork, after the whispered condolences from a nurse who had seen too many goodbyes, Aaliyah stepped outside into the evening air. The sky was dimming, streaks of orange melting into purple. Cars passed, life continued, and she stood there, feeling like the world should have stopped for just 1 second. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A text from the unknown number. Did you make it to her? Aaliyah wiped her eyes with the back of her sleeve. Her hands shook as she typed back. She's gone. There was a long pause, long enough for her to wonder if he'd disappeared like everyone else. Then his reply came. I'm sorry, Aaliyah. No one should carry that alone. Just one message. Simple, quiet. But at that moment, it held her together better than any prayer. For the next 2 days, Aaliyah moved through life like her body was present, but her spirit hadn't caught up yet. Church sisters came by with food she couldn't eat. Neighbors hugged her with long, heavy arms. Cousins whispered prayers in the hallway. But when night fell and the house got quiet, it was just her grief, and the silence her mother left behind. On the third evening, as she sat alone on the back porch staring at the magnolia tree her mother planted years ago, her phone buzzed. The same unknown number. Aaliyah, how are you holding up? Her fingers hovered before replying. I don't know. His answer came almost instantly. Then let me ask something different. What would you do if the world gave you one chance to build the life you wanted? Aaliyah blinked, confused. No one had ever asked her that. Her life was always about surviving, not dreaming. She typed slowly. I build a place for women like my mama. Somewhere peaceful, somewhere safe. A home, not a facility. He read it, paused, then replied, then come to New York. Her breath caught. What? Why? Because talking on a phone won't bring this to life, but a conversation across a table might. She almost laughed. She had nothing to wear, nowhere to stay, no money, no reason anyone like him would care. She typed, I can't afford anything in New York. His answer was short, steady. I didn't ask you to pay. I asked you to come. 2 days later, Aaliyah stood outside a warm restaurant in Tribeca, clutching her mother's old navy dress around her trembling body. When she stepped inside, he was already there. Clean white shirt, sleeves rolled, hair slightly undone, as if he'd rushed between worlds just to meet her. He stood when she approached. "Aaliyah," he greeted softly. "I'm glad you came." They talked for an hour, about her mother, about her dream, about the kind of home older black women deserved, one filled with dignity, sunlight, and a porch where stories didn't die with them. Near the end of their meal, he slid a small envelope across the table. She hesitated. "What's this?" "Your beginning," he said. Inside was a check, not a donation, not charity, a partnership, seed money, a promise. Aaliyah covered her mouth, tears rising. "Why me?" she whispered. He met her eyes, steady and sure. "Because you're the kind of woman who builds what the world forgets." Weeks passed, but the grief didn't vanish. It softened, slow, fragile, like morning light spreading across a dark room. Aaliyah spent her days meeting church elders, retired nurses, social workers, and women who would spend their whole lives caring for everyone else but themselves. Every conversation planted a seed. Every memory of her mother watered it. Then one warm afternoon, she stood before 6 quiet acres behind an old pecan grove. Land the church helped her secure, funded by the seed money resting in her purse, and held together by a dream she never believed she had permission to chase. Wind rustled the branches overhead. Birds scattered into the open sky. And for the first time since the funeral, Aaliyah felt her heartbeat steady. "This is it, Mama," she whispered. The gravel shifted behind her. She turned to see him walking toward her. No suit, no entourage, no cameras. Just a man who kept his word. He stopped beside her, hands in his pockets, eyes scanning the land with quiet respect. "You chose a beautiful place," he said. "It feels like her," Aaliyah replied. They walked the property together, slow and thoughtful. She showed him where the porch would go, where rocking chairs would sit beneath the shade, where a kitchen window might open to morning laughter. He listened to every detail, not as a billionaire, not as someone who built skyscrapers, but as someone who finally understood the weight of the story carried by a daughter who refused to let her mother fade. When they reached the edge of the clearing, Aaliyah placed a small tin on the ground. Inside were the last ashes she'd kept. She knelt, dug a small patch of earth, and let them fall gently into the soil. "I brought you home," she whispered. He stood back, giving her space. No advice, no interruptions, just presence. As she stood, he spoke quietly. "She'd be proud of you." Aaliyah shook her head. "No," she said softly. "She'd be proud of what we're building for women like her." A silence settled, warm, not heavy. She looked over the land, touched the pecan trunk with her fingertips, and breathed in the scent of beginnings. This wasn't survival anymore. This was purpose, legacy, a home for forgotten stories, starting with her own. She closed her eyes and felt the sun on her face, imagining her mother sitting on that future porch, sweet tea in hand, humming the same hymn she always did on Sunday mornings. And for the first time in her life, Aaliyah smiled without breaking. Share if you believe stories like hers deserve the world's attention.